Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining this webinar on a new module on Introduction to Climate Information Services for Agriculture. Um, so my name is James Hansen, or Jim Hansen. It's my preferred name. I'm an agricultural systems scientist by training, working at the International Research Institute for Climate and Society as part of the Columbia University Climate School. I'm going to go ahead and give you a short overview of this course. So this course came out of the ICRA project. ICRA is accelerating the impact of CGIAR research in Africa. It has a goal of increasing smallholder farmers' access to, use of, and benefit from climate information services and climate smart agriculture across Africa, targeting 6 countries, Senegal, Mali, Ghana, Ethiopia, Kenya, and Zambia, but with the expectation that there would be spillover benefits working through uh, regional organizations, including Reform. So there have been some exciting advances in climate information services and the capacity of national meteorological services to provide useful information. But the use and the impact of climate services are constrained by gaps in awareness, foundational knowledge, and practical skills within the agricultural professional community in many countries in Africa. In July, we had a joint workshop with Reform and a number of other organizations, including several universities from Kenya, that aim to advance and harmonize the co-development of climate-related curricula for sharing through the Reform network and online platform. At that meeting, we agreed on the design of 3 introductory modules with a particular target audience as university instructors: Climate Basics, Introduction to Climate Information Services for Agriculture, and Introduction to Climate Smart Agriculture. So right now we are piloting the Introduction to Climate Information Services for Agriculture in webinar format to get your feedback so we can improve it, so you can give us an idea of what works, what doesn't work, how we can improve the content and presentation. We're doing this webinar, as you saw in the announcement, over 3 days, 2 sessions per day. There are 6 sessions in this module. Climate Information Services, what is it, why? 4 pillars of climate services. Demand responsive climate services. How does risk impact agriculture? So looking at the role of climate in agricultural production, risk concepts, and then how do extreme events, how do climate uncertainty impact the well-being of rural populations who depend on agriculture? Climate, let's say agricultural decision-making in a variable climate. Climate services only have value if they help decision makers make better decisions in the face of climate risk. So we'll provide some foundational knowledge. First of all, talking about what do we mean by what makes an agricultural decision climate sensitive, time scales in climate and in decision making, risk aversion, and some tools that can be used to guide climate sensitive agricultural decisions. Uses, applications of climate services in agriculture, adapting agriculture to historical climate, seasonal forecasts, index-based agriculture insurance, and food security, early warning, early action initiatives. Communication issues in climate services. Why do weather information and climate information need different communication strategies? And then we'll talk about participatory communication processes, digital and media institutional networks, and how these can be combined to make climate services better serve the needs of agricultural decision makers, in particular the farming communities. And then social justice issues in climate services, climate justice concepts and how they apply to climate services through data poverty, gender equity, and the tension between public goods and private goods climate service models. So with that, I'll go ahead and go right into the first session. I'm assuming and hoping everyone can hear me clearly.
Somehow skipping, Jim.
Oh, uh-oh.
Yeah, thank you so much for giving that overview. Participants, we just want to request that you don't send messages while the presentations are going on, because then we wouldn't be able to see some of the text. So please don't send messages. I know we structured this to accept messages, but don't. And still you'll have an opportunity to ask your questions in case you have questions as the session is going on. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Florence. So we'll go ahead and go right into the first session, climate information services. The learning objectives are, at the end of this, you should be able to describe what is a climate information service or climate service, discuss how CIS can contribute to agriculture, describe each of the 4 pillars of climate services, define co-production in the context of climate services, and discuss what is needed for climate services to respond to the needs of farmers and other agricultural decision makers. You'll hear me go back and forth between climate services, climate information services, and the abbreviation CIS. They mean the same thing. So 4 topics. What are climate information services? Why are climate information services important for agriculture? The 4 pillars of climate services, and what is needed for climate services to be responsive to demand. So what are climate information services? Before we can answer that, we have to deal with a few key concepts.
The slides. I think
Are you sharing slides?
Oh, hold on. Oh. Were you able to see the slides in my overview presentation?
No, you were not showing the slides.
Oh, I apologize for that. Can you see now?
Yes, please.
Okay. Yeah, I apologize. So the overview presentation, I think you should have heard the basics. I don't think there's any need to repeat that. That will be made available. So, yeah, I went over the learning objectives, overview, and now we're going into the first topic, what are climate information services? So anytime you're exposed to a new concept, there's always some terminology involved. So let's review a few key concepts and key terms. So the Earth's atmosphere is dynamic. It's constantly changing across a continuum of time scales. And this is kind of a key feature of climate, and one of the things that makes climate particularly challenging in the case of agriculture. It's useful to think of different let me move participant this out of the way. Okay. It's useful to divide those variations in the atmosphere into different time scales with different words. So weather, when we talk about weather, we're talking about the state of the atmosphere at any given time. So you think of, for example, the current conditions. If you look outside, today's observed rainfall temperature, the amount of rainfall recorded yesterday, forecasts up to about a week into the future are considered to be weather. Weather forecasts make a prediction of what temperature and rainfall will be like each day, or sometimes shorter time scales. It can include alerts about extreme weather conditions or impacts on agriculture at the same time scale. Climate is best described as the statistics of weather, but statistics calculated over fairly long time periods. Kind of a rule of thumb is 30 or more years to calculate statistics. And these can include long-term averages, but we're not just interested in average conditions when we talk about climate. We're interested in variability around the average. So that's best expressed in terms of probability distribution, or statistics like standard deviation that describe a probability distribution. Seasonal cycles, annual seasonal cycles, long-term trends, if and when they exist. And when we talk about climate change, we are concerned about those long-term trends. These statistics are often shown with mathematical statistical descriptions, maps, but perhaps most often graphs. Climate can further be divided into climate variability. So this has to do with the natural fluctuations within the atmosphere that are driven by natural processes, typically over time scales ranging from several months to maybe a decade or a little over a decade. Climate information includes the type of analyses that I showed in the past screen, graphs, analyses of how the climate behaved in the past at these time scales, and also forecasts at a seasonal time scale, which is typically 3 months or longer, possibly multiple years, although the state of climate science only rarely allows forecasts at that time scale. Then climate change, many people, when they hear the term climate, they assume that we're talking about climate change, but climate variability has existed before climate change, and climate variability has always been a challenge for farmers and other agricultural decision makers. So climate change refers to long-term, possibly irreversible changes in climate statistics over timescales of decades to centuries or longer, caused largely by human action and leading to changes in the atmospheric composition and changes in the global energy balance. Timescales of information become really important when we're dealing with decision makers and the types of services that they need. So think about going to longer and longer timescales, from weather, a few days to weeks, to climate variability, months to years, to climate change, decades to centuries. As the timescale increases, well, first, the information becomes more complex. Information is a fundamental characteristic of the climate system. And as we go to a climate timescale, any kind of information, whether it's a description of the past or a prediction of the future, is inherently probabilistic. And when we introduce the language of probability, that creates a level of complexity. And the graphs and statistics that are used to describe climate also may have a steep learning curve for many decision makers. Another thing that happens as we go from a weather to a climate variability to a climate change timescale is that personal experience becomes less useful. There's a rule of thumb in statistics that also applies to psychology, and that is that any kind of a reliable estimate of statistics requires about 30 observations. I've read at least one psychologist dealing with climate services who suggests that a decision maker needs to experience a particular type of climate prediction and the outcome of it and its use in decision making about 30 times to really start to understand it, to be able to assess the climate conditions, how much to trust the forecast, how to use it. So think of a farmer who may consult a weather forecast twice a week and consider how it might be used in her farming operations. Well, that farmer might experience weather forecasts in a single agricultural season. That same farmer might need a lifetime to experience 30 seasonal forecasts available at the beginning of, or just before the beginning of the main growing season. And so the trial and error learning that works well for something like weather forecasts just takes too long to be useful in the case of climate information, whether it's historical or forecast. Another challenge as we go from a weather to a climate timescale is that farmer decisions tend to become more farmer specific and context specific. If you think about a population of farmers having the same production system, same crop or livestock system, once a crop is established in the ground, most farmers may be concerned with the same types of short-term management decisions like is there water stress that requires supplemental irrigation? Do weather conditions make it possible for a pest or disease problem to emerge? Is this the right time to plant? But if we think of a longer time scale, before the growing season starts, at a climate time scale, these farmers are faced with many other strategic decisions, and a lot of them have to do with how they allocate their scarce resources, their family labor, their limited land, limited capital, savings, ability to borrow. And those sorts of farm level resource allocation decisions are very sensitive to differences in individual goals, individual resource constraints, individual attitudes towards risk. So if you look at these together, climate services, if they're going to be effective in the case of agriculture, they require a lot more support for decision makers than merely disseminating information at a climate timescale. So if we think about a weather service, that would typically include reports about yesterday's rainfall or recent rainfall and temperature and forecasts out the next few days. That information should be disseminated broadly. It doesn't need a lot of interpretation or education. But climate services are more than just disseminating information. That begs the question, what are climate services? What do they need? There are several definitions of climate services or climate information services. All of the definitions that I've seen include somehow the connection between climate information and decision making. The definitions that come out of climate information provider organizations, communities, put a lot of emphasis on the climate information and the underlying climate science. So for example, the World Meteorological Organization, which is a United Nations organization that supports national meteorological services, that has a main mandate for weather and climate information, defines a climate service as the provision and use of climate data, information, and knowledge to assist decision-making. On the other hand, organizations that include various climate service user communities tend to define climate services more broadly. So it's no longer very active, but there's a climate services partnership, a professional community of practice that included a very broad range of participants across information provider and user communities internationally. The Climate Service Partnership defines the climate service as the production, translation, transfer, and use of climate knowledge and information and climate-informed decision-making, climate-smart policy and planning. So we've talked a little bit about what our climate service is. Why are we talking about it in the context of agriculture? So briefly, I think all of us can appreciate that agriculture is intimately linked to climate and very sensitive to the impacts of climate at all time scales, from weather to climate variability to climate change. So farming and other aspects of agricultural production, we think of pastoralism, herding, for fisheries. These are among the most weather-dependent sources of livelihood for individuals. And individuals who depend on agriculture for their livelihood are often relatively poor, disadvantaged, marginalized, quite vulnerable. And if you think about at the national level, climate is also typically one of the most climate sensitive economic sectors. So climate is obviously very important for agriculture. And we can infer that managing climate risk is important for agriculture as well. But managing climate risk requires understanding and anticipating that risk. Climate information services make that possible. They can support risk management decisions by farmers, governments, humanitarian organizations, agricultural value chain actors. And by doing so, climate information services are a mechanism to enhance the resilience of agriculture. There's, of course, growing concern about adapting to climate change. Climate information services are an essential part of an enabling environment for climate change agriculture adaptation. And we can also say that it's part of the enabling environment for climate smart agriculture. So most agricultural decisions, especially at the farm level, are concerned with the current climate, not conditions 30 to 50 years into the future. If we can learn as an agricultural community to manage climate in the present, this provides a pathway for reducing vulnerability and building capacity to adapt to a harsher climate in the future. The 4 pillars of climate services. You recall that the Climate Services Partnership defines a climate service in terms of the production, translation, transfer, and use of climate knowledge and information. Each of those can be thought of as one of the pillars of climate services. If any of them are missing, you probably don't really have a climate service, or at least it'll be weak and it'll be difficult for decision makers to fully benefit from climate services. So this diagram is something that my institution, the International Research Institute for Climate and Society, often uses when it describes climate services. So generation of climate information. This involves the production of climate data, converting data into information and knowledge. So data, that's measurements, numbers, how much rainfall was there on a particular day. Information is expressing often summaries of data or forecasts based on data. That would be information. And then knowledge involves the ability to interpret, ability to apply it to decision making and understanding of what might be driving climate. So it also includes the predicting the future, forecasts, a range of lead times, from weather to climate change, to climate variability, seasonal climate forecast to climate change projections. Now that's looking into the future, but generation of climate information also looks into the past through the collection, the management, and the analysis of climate observation records from most often ground stations that have rain gauges and instruments to measure temperature, wind speed, solar radiation, humidity, sometimes other variables. So all of these are the mandate of National Meteorological Services. Every country that has a functioning government has a National Meteorological Service, or NMS. At a minimum, every country that has an airport has to have a National Meteorological Service, because international airlines won't fly into a country unless they have good information about the atmosphere. But National Meteorological Services have the mandate for providing weather and climate information for a range of stakeholders and sectors. Translation involves combining climate and other types of information to increase their relevance to decision makers. So translating raw climate information into something that has direct implications for your decision and for you as a decision maker. So in the case of agriculture, we could think of a climate-based forecast of crop production or rangeland conditions or availability of water resources for irrigation. We can also think of bringing climate information into agricultural management advisory, agriculture extension advisories, and computer-based decision support tools that can guide extension agents or commercial farmers to help them understand the impacts, the implications of their decision options. So generation in each country has a public sector institution, the National Meteorological Service, that's clearly responsible for that role. It's a little bit less clear in the case of translation, but if we think outside of the area of climate, in general, agricultural research and extension systems play the role of developing agricultural management advisories and communicating them. So the development of agricultural extension recommendations, if they include weather and climate information, then those institutions would be playing a climate service translation role. Transfer. I'm not exactly sure why the Climate Services Partnership selected transfer instead of communication, but this is really about communication, how to get the information from the information providers to the final decision makers. So I want to first emphasize that this is not about dissemination. As a good example of dissemination, I am disseminating information to the, how many of you are there on this call? The 339 participants. Okay. So a webinar with 339 participants is not really an opportunity for us to sit down together and discuss. I can't hear all of your questions and respond to them. So in a sense, this is dissemination. It's one-way communication. You're the receivers, I'm the sender. But that has some real limitations. I don't know if all of you are catching things. I can't see the expressions on your face. For this to be more effective, two-way communication would be helpful. And this is true also in climate information services. Now, this pillar is especially challenging and important in the case of agriculture, because we're dealing with, in a given country, maybe millions of individual decision makers. So the number, the remoteness, and the constraints of those decision makers, farmers, pastoralists, artisanal fishers, make this transfer pillar particularly important and particularly challenging in the case of agriculture. So again, I'll mention agriculture extension. Each most countries have a public sector organization that's responsible for bringing information and advisories to the farming community and building the capacity. Now, in most African countries, the Agriculture Extension Service, the Public Extension Service, is underfunded, and so in many countries, private extensions, advisory service provider, or development organizations are stepping in to fill that gap. I would argue that increasing the strengthening the partnership between agriculture extension providers and climate information providers, particularly the National Meteorological Service, is one of the most promising ways to make climate services effective for the agricultural sector. So we'll talk more about communication in session 5. And finally, use. So use involves incorporating translated and transferred climate knowledge, climate information into decision processes or policies. So it is the responsibility of the end user, the decision makers, but service providers can support the use pillar, for example, by providing training or other forms of support for agricultural decision makers. We'll talk more about decision making, the use of climate services in section 4. So a lot of this discussion and the way this diagram has been drawn suggests that information flows from information providers towards users. But climate services are not going to be very effective unless they are responsive to demand, responsive to the needs of decision makers. And in the case of agriculture, those decision makers, smallholder farmers, in many cases, come with a lot of disadvantages and challenges. So how do we make sure the climate services are demand responsive? Well, this introduces an important term that in recent years has been adopted widely in the climate services community, and that's co-production. So co-production is involves a collaboration between users of a service and providers of that service in the design, the implementation, and evaluation of that service. And if this is done iteratively, then over time, that will improve the relevance and therefore the use and impact of that service. So co-production can be thought of as a participatory process that values users' knowledge and gives them an effective voice in the service. So in the case of co-production, there's a reversal of roles. The meteorologist, the agricultural researcher, isn't just the expert that educates the farmers. They become the learner and learn from the farmers and with the farmers. Now, this sounds like kind of before I get to that. So this also implies that the arrows from the right to the left in this diagram are at least as important as the arrows from the left to right. And that is to say that the flow of information from users, from decision makers back to institutions that are involved in the generation, translation, and transfer. Flow of information, but also influence is as important as the dissemination, the one-way communication of information downstream towards the decision makers. This concept is widely adopted, but it doesn't always work. It is challenging in practice. So I'll give you a list of some constraining factors, some factors that can get in the way of effective co-production, and then I'll give you a list of enabling factors. So we said that co-production involves interaction between service providers and service users. If service providers approach those interactions thinking that they're the expert, and their goal is to educate users to use the information that they design, that they're producing in the format that they have decided through the channels that they have selected. It's not going to go anywhere. Extractive interaction. So this can happen if a development funder funds a project and has a mandate that there's, for example, stakeholder consultation workshop. If the institutions who are involved do it just because they have to, but don't really have any intention of changing how they provide the services, it may not do anything. The users may recognize that they're basically being used to check a box. Restrictive interaction, if the questions are asked in a way that limits user input, then it's not effective. So an example, if a National Meteorological Service asks farmers which of the existing products do they find more useful, or which communication channel that farmers were that the Met Service uses to disseminate information is preferred, this limits answers to existing services. It doesn't really open up the possibility that farmers need something that the Met Meteorological Service doesn't provide, or would actually prefer a communication process that is not yet available. We can have the same problem if users don't really know what information could be provided. So there is quite a bit of evidence that farmers can benefit from types of information that are just not available routinely in their country unless a project introduces it. So if a farming community has little awareness for, if they've not been exposed to a particular type of information, even if it would benefit them if it was available, if they've never been exposed, or if they realize that it's important, but they don't know that it's feasible, then it's hard for them to really negotiate with technical experts at a meteorological service to make the case that this is needed and it can feasibly be provided. So that's a constraint on the demand capacity side. On the supply capacity side, that can also be challenging. National Meteorological Services tend to be seriously underfunded in most of Africa. They have very limited resources, so they may lack the capacity and flexibility to respond to user needs. In some countries, they sit within Ministry of Transport or Ministry of Commerce, and so their official mandate emphasizes, transportation, for example, shipping and airlines. And so they may not have a lot of accountability or mandate or even freedom to really step up and serve the agricultural sector if they're not within the Ministry of Agriculture. So that can limit their ability to respond as they do learn about user needs. And then also co-production can be ineffective if important stakeholders are missing. So at the grassroots level, if lead farmers are included, but say, for example, women farmers or farmers who are less educated or farmers who are otherwise socially or economically marginalized, if they are not part of the conversation, then a co-production process may not help them. But also, if it's a bilateral discussion between the National Meteorological Service and the farmer, if agriculture extension, if agricultural research, if the institutions that serve those farmers are not involved, then it may also be ineffective. So let's take the flip side. What can allow co-production to help climate services respond better to the needs of farmers and other agriculture users? Well, first, sustained, respectful, two-way interaction that genuinely values user knowledge. So it's the opposite of some of the things that I mentioned as constraining factors. Sustained over a period of time. Co-production can best be thought of as an iterative process. As decision makers learn more and more, they can communicate that information. So co-learning uh, between information providers and users over time can gradually improve services. If users have the capacity to express demand for information that might not yet exist through training, through participatory activities that expose them to new types of information that can empower them to express that demand. Building the capacity of national meteorological services and governance processes that also create accountability to respond to user demand can help reduce the gap between what meteorological services provide and what farmers need. Boundary spanning organizations. So a boundary spanning institution, a boundary institution or organization is an organization that has some knowledge of climate science and climate information, the meteorological community, some knowledge of the decision-making community. In our case, we're talking about agriculture farmers, and that's able to use that knowledge to kind of bridge the gap between the end users, the farming community, the agricultural sector, and the meteorological service, the information providers. We can understand the jargon of both and translate the messages that can amplify farmers' voices, that has the knowledge and influence to be able to negotiate on behalf of users with the meteorological service and maybe build their capacity to respond to those demands. And then finally, inclusive participation by all relevant stakeholders, including groups that tend to be neglected or marginalized. We think of rural women, relatively poor smallholder farmers, farmers who might be a minority in terms of language or ethnicity. So it is time for a quiz to test your knowledge. And I believe I'm going to be turning it over to implement this quiz. So should I stop? Oh, okay. So a poll has been shared. Are there any instructions on how to do it? I guess it's pretty self-explanatory. I'll give you 5 minutes to go through this.
Participant, you have 5 minutes to answer this quiz. It will end automatically.
I'd like to make one quick comment. I tended to ask questions in the negative. So which of the following does not describe a climate service? Please read the question carefully. I see in the chat that some of the participants are not sure. They don't see the poll.
1.5 minutes remaining. Five minutes over, but Prof, I see half of the participants on the answers quiz. You like to have more minutes, or I end the poll, Prof?
Perhaps
No,
we could
Prof.
give an extra minute because some were having trouble finding or accessing the poll.
Okay. Okay. We can have more 2 minutes.
Okay, I think all of those who could find the poll, I believe, are finished.
Yes, Prof.
Uh,
There are like around 250 out of 360 they respond to the questions. Like 70% out of the 100. Should we
Okay.
end or?
Yes, I think so. And I'll talk through the answers and you can grade me and see how I did.
Okay, would you like us to share the result in the screen?
I will share it on my I put it in my PowerPoint slides. Okay, question
Okay.
1. Which of the following does not describe a climate service or CIS? The correct answer is an advanced weather prediction model based on artificial intelligence. It might be a component of a climate service, but if it doesn't explicitly connect to decision makers or decision making, it's not a climate service. Climate services must include both the information and its use for decision making. Number 2, which of the following statements about climate information services for agriculture is false? Correct answer is D. Climate services involve adding agriculturally relevant information at a climate timescale to weather services. I emphasize that because of the challenges, the complexity of the information, the uncertainty, aspects of decision making, climate services must involve a lot more support than weather services. Decision makers need much more support, and so it's more than just adding climate information to an existing weather service. Question 3 is matching. Match each example with the most relevant climate services pillar. So how did we do on that? An agriculture extension organization issues an advisory to plan early based this should be plant early based on a forecast of early rainy season onset. That should be plant instead of plan. So turning the forecast into a management advisory is translation. Food Security Organization triggers relief interventions in response to a drought early warning. So triggering an intervention, a release of funds to actually act is part of use. A National Meteorological Service produces a seasonal climate outlook. That's generation, the production of climate information. A development NGO holds a workshop to explain the seasonal climate outlook to local government and farmer organizations. So that's transfer. This is a communication activity. And number 4, which 3 of the following activities are most likely to make a climate service responsive to farmer demand? The correct answers are a pilot project that facilitates discussion between farmers, agriculture extension officers, and meteorologists. An interdisciplinary research institute that uses its understanding of climate and agriculture to bridge the gap between them. So this is what we refer to as a boundary organization and boundary spanning. And ongoing annual meetings between farmers and climate information providers. So those are all effective ways to make climate services more demand responsive. Educating, asking farmers what information product from the National Meteorological website they prefer. It limits farmers' input. It doesn't allow farmers to ask for something that's not already available. Same thing with D, educating farmers to interpret seasonal outlook maps that the farmers have had no input into the design of. It again restricts their input. Okay, so that's it for the first session. This session is slightly shorter than some of the others. And we're on time, slightly ahead of schedule. Tomorrow and Thursday, it may be a little bit more challenging because there's more content. So let's go ahead and now that we've been we've had an introduction to climate information services for agriculture. What are they? Why? What do they consist of? How do we make sure that they are responsive to demand? Now we'll move into discussion of climate impacts. So screen sharing. Okay. I'm assuming that all of you can see my screen now.
Yes,
Okay, so
Prof, I
session.
can see.
Okay, great. So session 2 is how climate risk impacts agriculture. So we're kind of stepping back from the climate information to really understand how to use climate services for agriculture. We need to understand a little bit more. Why is climate important? How is climate important for agriculture? So objectives are to, at the end of this session, you should be able to list examples of weather and climate impacts on biological productivity. You should be able to define some terms and concepts. You should be able to describe pathways by which climate shocks or extreme climate events and climate uncertainty can impact the well-being of rural households. To be able to talk about what happens, the impacts of a slow onset shock and a rapid onset shock, and be able to differentiate between the two. And you should be able to identify 2 mechanisms by which the negative impacts of a climate shock can persist long after climate conditions return to normal. So 4 topics: role of climate in agricultural production, risk concepts and terms, impacts of extreme events, impacts of climate uncertainty. I'm assuming that most of you have a strong agricultural background, and you probably know in a lot more detail the role of climate in agricultural production than what I'm going to show here. But just a few basic things as a reminder, as awareness. So climate is both a resource for agriculture that makes agricultural production possible, but also a source of risk that can make agriculture challenging. So this is not a comprehensive treatment of how weather and climate conditions influence crops and livestock, but just a few examples. So when we talk about climate, the atmosphere, we describe it with a few parameters. I already mentioned several times precipitation or rainfall, temperature. But let's start with solar radiation. That drives photosynthesis, which is a mechanism by which plants convert carbon dioxide from the air into plant biomass, and therefore the products that we eat, that we sell, that we use for so many different purposes. Temperature drives the rate of crop development, the time to maturity, but temperature also rates the rate of most plant physiological processes. When temperatures get too high or too hot or too cold, those extremes can damage plant tissues and reduce growth, productivity. Precipitation. So plants need water. They get water from the soil, but the soil gets water from precipitation. In some cases, also with irrigation. So precipitation supplies water to the plant, but through the soil-water balance. But precipitation also drives the movement of nutrients from the soil into the plant. So the availability of the movement of soil nutrients and water available from the soil are driven by precipitation. So just like precipitation represents the supply of water, potential evapotranspiration represents the demand for water. Potential evapotranspiration, which is a function of things like temperature, wind, humidity, this drives the uptake of water through the plant, but also the uptake of nutrients from the soil. If demand in the form of potential evapotranspiration is much greater than the supply of water from the soil, then this causes stress, which can damage the crop, lead to a reduction of productivity. Wind is one of the things that goes into potential evapotranspiration. Wind can have a direct impact on crops if it's excessive. So lodging, a windstorm can topple a crop, causing a complete loss of production in some cases. Now we think of biological threats to crops, including insect pests, disease pathogens. These often interact with climate, particularly temperature, humidity, and wind. They can affect population dynamics and movement. They don't cause pest outbreaks, they don't cause diseases, but they can create conditions that are conducive to those biological threats to crop productivity. Now, in the case of livestock, weather climate is not a direct resource that is used. It's not used in the same way, for example, that photosynthesis is used by plants to produce biomass. Most of the influence of weather and climate on livestock productivity is more indirect. So we think of water supply, drought. Inadequate rainfall can reduce feed available from rangeland forage fodder to animals. If we have pastoralism. And in pastoralist communities, if a severe or prolonged drought reduces the availability of the supply of food through rangelands, so that they can no longer support the animal density, then there have been cases of very widespread livestock mortality, and the loss of herd can cause a great deal of suffering to pastoralist communities. High temperature and humidity tends to reduce weight gain and milk production in animals. Hazards such as flood, windstorms, lightning can lead to mortality of animals if they're not sheltered. And just like in the case of crops, temperature, humidity, and wind can affect the dynamics and movements of insect pests and vector-borne diseases that can affect the productivity or even mortality of agricultural animals. This is not by any means a complete list, but just kind of a reminder, brief overview. So climate variability, we talked about that a little bit. Rainfall, temperature, length of the rain-fed growing season, these can vary considerably from year to year. And this can affect the variability in crop productivity, livestock productivity, rangeland conditions. In the case of rain-fed crop production in dry subhumid to semi-arid environments, rainfall tends to be the most important source of variability in crop production. The total amount of rainfall is important, but dry spells, if they occur at critical stages of crop development, can have a big impact on productivity. But also the timing of the start and the end of rainfall can be important because it determines the growing period for a crop. If the growing period is too short, the crop may not make it to maturity and you'll have a loss of yields. If the growing season is longer than the growth period of the crop, then you're not taking advantage of all of the available period, all of the available solar radiation to generate biomass. And so either way, if the crop if the crop's time to maturity doesn't match the rain-fed growing season length, you will lose productivity. Temperature can be more important in certain circumstances. So, for example, in highland regions of the tropics or in temperate zones that are subject to frost, if a frost occurs while the crop is growing, then you can have damage and loss of production. Crops that are grown near the upper limit of their heat tolerance. This is a growing concern, for example, in the case of coffee. As temperatures are rising, we have more and more seasons where productivity and quality is affected. But in many other cases, in hot climates, you can have loss of crop productivity because of heat waves. Either hot spells or cold spells, it can be damaging, particularly if they occur during critical periods of crop growth, crop development. But it's not just, well, variability of climate does affect variability of productivity, but it can also decrease average productivity. And this is because of the nonlinearity of crop response, plant response to the environment. So plant response to any climate variable is typically nonlinear, and it's also concave with respect to the x-axis here. So what you see here, the curve is I used a nonlinear regression to fit a curve of simulated maize yields at a particular location in Kenya to growing season rainfall. The dots on the bottom represent 5 years of seasonal rainfall. The mean is 280 millimeters, standard deviation of 50 millimeters, showing the variability. For any given year, you can read up on the graph the rainfall amount, see where it intersects the curve, go to the left, and you'll see the amount of yield associated with that particular amount of rainfall. Well, this is a simplification from reality, but it's just to illustrate a point. So we have 5 years of rainfall, the corresponding yields, and the average yield is 3.6 tons per hectare. If we take exactly the same average rainfall, but with higher variability in the right graph, the dots again on the bottom represent seasonal rainfall totals. Same mean, 280 millimeters, but a standard deviation now at 150 millimeters. If we do the same thing, look at the yield associated with each of those rainfall amounts, and the average is considerably lower. We didn't change average rainfall, we only changed its variability. But here, the negative deviations in low rainfall years have a bigger negative impact on yields than the positive deviations in high rainfall yields. And because of this, variability matters not just to the variability of production, but even to average production. As we shift from biological impacts to impacts on welfare, I want to first introduce a few terms and concepts that are related to risk. So variability has to do with it results from any kind of a random process that leads to variability in time. Rainfall last year was different from growing season rainfall the year before, which was different from the growing season rainfall 2 years before. And this stochastic variability in the past leads to uncertainty about the future. I don't know how much rain to expect in the next growing season because I know from my memory from the data that rainfall has been quite variable from year to year in the past. So for a farmer, in most conditions, the two types of stochastic variability in the environment that tend to be the most important are weather and climate, and then market prices, input and output prices. A hazard, well, there are several terms that are similar, overlapping. A climate hazard or a climate shock refers to some kind of a climate-related physical phenomenon that has the potential to trigger adverse impacts on human well-being. We often use the term extreme event. So this is not an extremely good event. This is an extremely bad event in terms of the impacts on well-being. So we can think of, for example, a flood, a drought, a heat wave. Those would be examples of climate hazards or climate shocks that have the potential to have a negative impact on well-being. So risk is different from variability. Variability is a value neutral term, but risk happens when variability has an impact on well-being. For example, productivity, profitability, food security, food consumption, some aspect of human well-being. If I were to ask you now, I'm suspecting that we would get a few different definitions of risk. There are actually two important definitions that come from different communities with different perspectives. They are both valid, but they are not consistent. So one perspective, which I call the hazard perspective, treats risk as the likelihood or the probability that a disaster or some kind of a damaging event will occur. From this perspective, risk focuses on undesirable extreme events. If we think about a probability distribution, it focuses on the tail of that probability distribution. Another perspective, which kind of dominates the agricultural economics literature, decision analysis, risk analysis, treats risk as a full range of variability of impacts, not just the extremes. And it also considers the impact of uncertainty about future climate conditions on well-being and particularly on decision making. So this suggests that if we're asking the question, how does climate variability impact human well-being, we need to think about extreme events, and we also need to think about uncertainty. We'll come back to this in a moment. Another related term, well, there are two terms that have to do with characteristics of a human household, community, country, social system. So vulnerability can be described as the characteristics of a human community or social system that cause them to be susceptible to adverse impacts when they experience a stochastic shock or long-term stress. So if variability turns into risk, if variability has a negative impact on human well-being, that suggests that there's something about that community, that population that makes it susceptible. And whatever that is, it's defined as vulnerability. And there are some contrasting ways that vulnerability is used. Some disciplines include exposure to shocks as part of the definition of vulnerability. Other disciplines treat the exposure to shocks as separate from vulnerability. Resilience is it's approximately the opposite of vulnerability, although it has a little bit of a different focus. So resilience can be thought of as the capacity of an individual, community, society to resist moving to a less desirable state, or to recover if it's already in an undesirable state in the face of stochastic shocks or long-term stresses. So now let's go to the look at the pathways from climate variability to well-being of a rural household or a rural community. So in the case of extreme events, it matters whether an extreme event, whether a climate shock is a slow onset shock or a rapid onset shock. When we think of a slow onset climate shock, it usually refers to drought. Drought doesn't happen in one day, but drought accumulates over time, weeks, months, sometimes even multiple years. In the case of crop-based or mixed farming, when a drought occurs, the first way that its impacts are felt are at harvest. There's a loss of food crop production. For animal agriculture, there may be loss of feed to feed the animals. So this has a direct impact on the ability of a household to meet its own subsistence needs from its own on-farm production. Now, if this occurs, it may also lead to an increase in the price of food crops in the market. If there's less food available because of a widespread drought, because of the law of supply and demand, the price may go up. This will not happen if the market is integrated, for example, within international markets, if trade flows, if food can flow freely across regions, across locations, that may buffer the impact. But if the local market is not well integrated, then a farm household may not be able to meet its own subsistence needs from its own production, but then the cost of buying that food in the market also goes up, which further reduces their ability to meet their food needs. A failed crop harvest can reduce income. Of course, it reduces farmers' income when a farmer is a net seller of food. But the rural economy is often tightly integrated, so an impact on production will have a spillover, cascading impact on various value chain actors, non-farm workers, many others may have a loss of income. So food becomes more expensive, and households on average have less money available to buy it, which further increases the food security impacts of a drought. And then finally, terms of trade can be affected. So to understand that, you can think of two of the strategies that many farm households will employ if they don't have enough food. They may try to sell their labor, looking for off-farm employment, or they may sell animals, large animals, ruminant animals, in order to have enough money to buy their staple food. Well, if many farmers are looking for off-farm jobs when the whole economy is suppressed because of the failed harvest, or if many farmers are selling animals at the same time, then the value of their labor or the value of their animals goes down. They can flood the market. And so all of these things work together to reduce the ability of a household to meet their basic food subsistence needs. And this will persist until the next harvest, hopefully, if climate conditions are more favorable the next season, then they will recover in the next year or the next growing season. Let me just scan really quickly. Scanning whether there's any crucial questions or comments. In the interest of time, and because of the challenge of the many questions and comments, we won't have a lot of opportunity for questions and answers. So rapid onset shock, we think, for example, of a flood. It could be a windstorm, a heat wave, a tropical cyclone. We call it rapid onset because the impacts may be experienced not in over months, but over hours. So we think of a flood or a storm. It can also have similar impacts on the standing crop, on the supply of food within a household, either by damaging stored food or damaging a crop in the field. Decreased food production, increased staple food price on the local market, decreased income, decreased terms of trade. But that extreme event may also damage infrastructure, might damage infrastructure buildings on the farm. But think about roads being washed out or roads being flooded. So this means that a farmer will not be able to get to the market to sell, but also not be able to get to the market to buy food, possibly. So this can reduce access to food that is available within the region. In some cases, these rapid onset shocks can lead to diseases. For example, water contamination can lead to diarrheal diseases, and this affects food utilization. People will not be able to absorb the food that they do eat if they have, for example, a diarrheal disease. So there can be several different mechanisms by which a storm or a flood can reduce food security. I mentioned that the impacts of either rapid or slow onset climate shock may be reduced. The household may experience relief if they have a good harvest the next year. But there are two mechanisms that can cause those impacts to persist long after climate conditions return to normal. So the first would be if the household implements coping strategies that deplete their productive assets. So normally, if a household does not have enough food, cannot get enough food to meet its basic subsistence needs, there are several coping strategies that they will implement to try to meet that shortfall. For example, looking for off-farm employment for extra income. If they have financial savings, consuming that. When they run out of savings, borrowing from banks or from family, from relatives. They may consume less preferred, which is often less nutritious food. They may ration meals and reduce overall consumption for adult family members. All of these coping strategies cause hardship, but those hardships tend to be resolved later once they have a good harvest. If the stress is too severe, if it lasts too long, if, for example, there are multiple crop failures in back-to-back years, then they may be forced to implement more severe coping strategies, damaging coping strategies. So this would include, for example, defaulting on loans. If you don't repay your loan, you may not be able to borrow in the future. Selling or bartering productive assets, such as your drought animal, your plow, a bicycle or motorbike, a vehicle. Withdrawing children from school so that they can forage, so that they can do low-pay menial tasks for income, so they can beg. Overexploiting natural resources. These types of coping strategies deplete productive assets, although they may help a family survive a period of stress. They will reduce their capacity to earn a good livelihood into the future. A second mechanism is health impacts. So people that work on food security often refer to the first 1,000 days of life from conception until the second birthday. During this period, if there's a if there's serious undernutrition, not enough food, not enough nutrition, it can lead to health impacts that persist throughout life, can affect the individual's physical health, mental health, and because of that impact, studies have traced impacts of climate shocks and undernutrition during the first 1,000 days to reduce the amount of education completed, reduce income, reduce wealth throughout adulthood. So there have been many studies that have looked at this, documented this effect. I mentioned two that are significant because they cover many different countries in Africa. This first one across the world. So this particular study looked at early childhood stunting without regard to what caused that stunting, reduced income in adulthood across 34 countries that account for 90% of the world's stunted children. So these are very long-term studies that have tracked the same populations over several decades. Another study looked specifically at the impact of drought on women in Africa. And they found that drought during early childhood, the first 1,000 days from conception to the second birthday, reduced average education completed, wealth in adulthood, but it also increased the likelihood that their children would have low birth weight. So there's an intergenerational transfer of these health impacts, even beyond the affected generation. Well, this held for rural women, women whose livelihoods directly or indirectly depend on agriculture, but not for urban populations. So we can summarize these pathways with this diagram. So climate variability, when it leads to extreme events, whether short-term rapid onset shocks or slow onset shocks, coping strategies may deplete productive assets, which can have a negative impact on well-being. Early life malnutrition leads to reduced human capital, human resources in the forms of physical and mental capacity. And that also can have an adverse impact on economic and health well-being long after climate conditions return to normal, long after the shock ends. So let's now shift from extreme events to variability and uncertainty. We can think of two different mechanisms by which uncertainty related to climate impacts farmer decision-making. I haven't seen any term for this, so I coined the term, the moving target effect on agricultural decision-making. So let's assume that a farmer wants to maximize expected profit. That decision maker, that farmer, not knowing what the weather conditions will be like for the upcoming year, may select the management that is optimal, that leads to the highest average productivity, that's optimal across average weather conditions. That seems like a reasonable strategy. However, there's actually no such thing as an average growing season. A farmer will never experience an average growing season. Even if total rainfall for the growing season is average, the distribution is always going to be different. So there's no such thing as an average growing season in terms of weather conditions. And management that is optimal for average conditions can be far from optimal in the weather conditions in most growing seasons. So let me just briefly illustrate this with an example. So this is an example of using crop simulation models and a simple enterprise budget. And tomorrow I'll introduce those tools very briefly. to calculate the gross margins or the net income per hectare from different maize management options. So the management options that we looked at were planting density, how many plants per square meter, and fertilizer rate, how many kilograms of nitrogen per hectare in a particular growing season and a particular time of year in a particular location in Kenya. So the first row shows average plants per square meter, fertilizer rates, yields, and net income, Kenyan shillings per hectare. If the farmer could anticipate what growing season rainfall would be like, and if she selected the optimal management, the optimal fertilizer rate and planting density for every year's actual weather data. So this requires perfect knowledge. Average yield would be 3.1 tons per hectare with about 23,000 Kenyan shillings per hectare of net income. But farmers don't know what the weather conditions will be like in each growing system. But let's assume that they have perfect knowledge of historical climate conditions, historical weather conditions, and they could select management that's optimal on average, that will maximize net income on average. So the average planting density, fertilizer rate is not very different between the two. The yields are much lower if you select management that's optimal on average. But even more so, there's a huge loss in net income just because you don't know what the growing conditions will be like from year to year. And so this moving target having to come up with management that's optimal on average causes, in this case, a 41% loss of average net income. But the situation is actually worse than that for a farmer, because farmers don't necessarily select management that's optimal on average because of risk aversion. So a risk-averse farmer wants to increase average income, but also wants to reduce risk in the form of variability of income. So because of this, a risk-averse farmer will not optimize for average conditions, but for poorer than average climate conditions. Another way to look at this is that although any farmer wants to increase productivity and profitability on average, the negative impacts of a poor growing season outweigh the positive impacts of a good growing season. It may not just be a reduction of income, it may be health of the family, loss of productive assets, some of the terrible impacts of extreme events that I just showed you. A farmer may select management that reduces the negative impacts of those extreme years, but sacrificing income in average years. So in practice, what this may mean would be selecting crops, varieties, management that in general reduces profitability while reducing risk. Risk aversion and climate-related risk is one of the main explanations for why uptake of various agricultural innovations, improved agricultural technologies is often low among smallholder farmers. So however it plays out in terms of farm decisions, risk aversion will tend to reduce average productivity and average profitability with the benefit of reducing risk, variability of income, or variability of productivity. This obviously affects farmers, but it also affects value chain actors. So a lender or an input supplier will be less willing to provide credit, extend credit to a smallholder farmer if they perceive that farmer to be risky. Or they may increase interest rates or provide credit at much worse terms. So these value chain actors may make decisions based on their risk aversion that further constrain the options that are available to the smallholder farmer. So here's a diagram that kind of shows these different mechanisms from climate variability through extreme events and through uncertainty towards negative impacts on the well-being of rural communities. Let me just quickly scan the Q&A. I don't want to take the time now to talk about how particular weather parameters affect agricultural pests and pathogens. Just scanning some of the questions in the Q&A. Artificial intelligence for weather forecasts. So I think that was probably referring to one of the multiple choice questions earlier. Oh, how does an increase in staple food prices lead to low income? That was referring to this diagram. These arrows don't necessarily represent cause and effect in every case. It's more that the reduction of food crop production. I could have redrawn this with arrows going in 3 directions to staple food prices, income, and terms of trade. So failed harvest will affect all 3 of these. It's not necessarily that increased food prices lead to reduced income, which leads to reduced terms of trade. It's just, I took a simplification in drawing the diagram. What is the impact of climate change on the development of gully erosion? That's kind of outside of what I'm intending to talk about here, so I'm not going to address that. I'll have to discuss with the Reform Secretariat how and when we're going to make materials available. The purpose of this pilot is basically to pilot, get feedback, build awareness, in a sense, socialize some new content that has been prepared jointly by Reform and IRI through the ICRA project, with the expectation that if feedback is positive, then we'll take any lessons and insights and at some point share improved materials online. And I think we'll have to wait for a detailed discussion about that. So those are the questions that I see in the Q&A box. Quiz time again. So let's put up the poll with the quiz, and we will take about 5 minutes to complete it, and then I will review the correct answers. Okay, the poll is up. I can see it on my screen. I'm hoping that all of you have it. I'm not the one controlling it, so if you're having problems accessing it, I noticed that several people did in the last quiz. So we'll take about 5 minutes. I'm starting my own timer. Let's see, where's my
Dear participant, half of the time passed and only 10% have answered the questions.
There's about half a minute more. Okay, it has been 5 minutes. I think you should have had time now to complete it.
Can we end Prof the prof or wait few seconds? I see people are answering now.
Oh, okay. Sure.
175 out of 329.
Okay.
We have a 55%.
Mhm.
Is that
Okay.
enough?
Yeah, we can,
Can end the
so,
vote?
so if more answers are coming in, we can give it maybe another 1 or 2 minutes.
Okay. Dear participant, 2 minutes to end the
Yeah.
quiz.
2 more minutes. I do see messages in the chat that some of the participants are again having difficulty seeing the poll.
I think they see the first question, but they can scroll down. You see, they see in the right side there is this ruler, the bar. They can just scroll down so they can get the other questions.
And I will review it, so you'll still have an opportunity to consider the answers and get feedback.
Okay. Seconds remaining. Prof, can we ending now?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, participant. You can share the result from your side now. Or you want me
Okay.
to share what the answer they asked? Okay,
I will share from my side.
okay.
So question 1, which of the following statements about the role of climate and agricultural productivity is false? The correct answer is C. C is false. Temperature tends to be the most important climatic driver of production variability in dryland agricultural systems in the tropics. In dryland agriculture, in most cases, variability of precipitation is the most important driver. By dryland, we mean rain-fed production in drier subhumid to semi-arid climates. Temperature may be more important in a few circumstances, but in this environment, it tends to be dominated by precipitation. Number 2, match each description or example to the most appropriate term. So this is the way that I match it. Characteristics of a rural community that make them susceptible to food insecurity when they experience a drought, that's vulnerability. A drought itself is a climate hazard, which is synonymous for a shock or extreme event. Impacts of climate variability on farm income, that is a risk. When risk has some direct impact on well-being, when variability has impact on well-being, it becomes risk. Year-to-year difference in growing season rainfall amount, that would be variability. And capacity of a farming community to recover after a drought, resilience. Number 3, which of the following statements about climate impacts on well-being of a rural household is false? Correct answer. The false statement is impacts of a slow onset climate shock tend to be more complex and more context specific than impacts of a rapid onset shock. The opposite is true. Just because the slow onset shock almost always refers to drought. Rapid onset shocks tend to be storms, flooding, things of that nature, which can create a wider range of impacts. Question 4, which of the following coping strategies is least likely to negatively affect a farm family's well-being 10 years after a severe drought? So this question asks for which of the mechanisms will not have a long-term impact? The correct answer is reducing meals by adult household members who provide family labor. If adult family members reduce their food consumption, it can cause hardship and health problems in the short term, but they will recover after the next harvest. But if a woman who's pregnant reduces her food consumption, it may affect the baby's physical and mental health and ability to earn an income all through life. I'm going to stop sharing. So that is it today for the content. I'm scanning the Q&A and comment. So some people put in the Q&A concerns about accessing the quiz, request for slides, other information. And here's a repeat of the question about artificial intelligence for weather forecasting. I'm simply not going to deal with that because that's not a main part of the content. So I don't see any clarification questions about the material that I covered. There are many, many comments in the chat. So we finished 2 out of 6 sessions. So tomorrow and Thursday, we're going to have the same schedule, starting at, was it 4 p.m., 1600 East Africa time, going 2 hours. Same format. I'm hoping that those of you who had difficulty with the poll, it will work out okay tomorrow. But I guess if I look at how many participants that we have tomorrow, it'll be an indication of whether this seems to be interesting and useful. I'm hoping that those of you who find it useful will continue over the next 2 days. And I think at the end, maybe we'll have a little bit of time to share from the reform side what the plans will be for making this available for next steps. So we'll defer questions about accessing course materials and others until Thursday at the end, if that's all right. So I want to thank all of you for taking the time. I wish we could have done this in a more interactive format. As you saw from my content, I'm not a fan of one-way dissemination. I prefer two-way communication. I would love to be able to sit with each of you over coffee and have a dialogue, but this forum doesn't allow it. But we will welcome feedback. I would like to improve the material as a result of your experience. And again, we'll talk Thursday about next steps and how to do that. So thank you so much, and I hope to see most or all of you again tomorrow.
Some housekeeping
anything?
as well, Jim.
Oh,
Yeah, some housekeeping.
uh,
Thank you so much, Jim. And we shall have an evaluation of the program at the end of the program, an evaluation of the materials, the content, and also the format as well. So colleagues, do come back tomorrow and you shall have a certificate of participation, but this certificate is given at the end of the 3 days, at the end of the 6 sessions that will have been provided. Thank you so much, Jim. See you tomorrow. We are using the same login details and it is the same time. Thank you.
okay. Well, thank you very much. Look forward to seeing you tomorrow.